So discovering this place was a complete and total and amazing surprise. We'd heard about it. We bought our house about 3 years ago, and it took us about a year to kind of get our bearings. And when we finally made it in here, I was speechless. I couldn't believe it. The work in the gallery, the people here, and like Suzanne said, you know, when I saw the old string, I thought I found it's like the wellspring for my life, because I go to flea markets and antique stores and garage sales looking for old string, the old string to match the historical time period. So much of the string is manufactured in Europe, a lot of it from the turn of the century all the way through the 60s. And so the colors, the palette, of course, is completely different, which you know when you go inside versus going into a contemporary yarn shop. Like our color palette taste is shifted. So that was amazing. And meeting Suzanne and being invited to have a show here has been honestly the most wonderful welcome that I could possibly have imagined. For me to be able to put my work in this fantastic place, in our new location, it's really been fantastic. I feel honored, and thank you very much. So this morning I'm going to talk to you about the series Beauty and Terror, about my process, my motivation, what got me interested, how I do it, the whole thing. And also I've included a couple of pieces at the end of some new work, because the series is complete. I also brought my newest piece, which is on the table over there. So my work continues to be about contemporary topics that basically are upsetting to me, because I make art in order to release that and to express myself and to share my concerns and feelings like all artists do. So the piece over there is about AI. So you can take a look at it. So for the past 15 or 16 years, which is how long I've been pressing string into wax, and particularly using the Holocaust and lessons and events from the Holocaust, this is how it has looked for me. Bringing together these two things has been really, I mean, it's not common to Holocaust education through art, visual art, contemporary visual art basically doesn't exist. Of course, survivors make art, and you can go into a museum and you can see work by Jewish artists, of course, that may use the Holocaust as their subject matter, but in contemporary art, it's not common. But that little sliver there in the middle is getting bigger. I've been showing the work. It's been picked up, you know, I've entered a few shows. It's been in a few magazine periodicals. It's here, like it's growing. So I'm very happy about that too, because it's pretty isolated kind of thing to do. So the series Beauty and Terror consists of 18 pieces, and the number 18 is significant in Judaism. You may have heard of people giving gifts in amounts of 18. In Jewish numerology, 18 is equivalent to the word life, l'chaim or chai in the Hebrew language. And so this reiteration about living, it made sense to me. When I got to about piece number 9, I was like, I think I'm actually making a series, and I think it should be 18 pieces. Makes the most sense. The 18 also is part of, there are 18 little blessings in Jewish liturgy. There's one particular important blessing called the Amida, and it has 18 parts. And I think that's also part of why 18 is important. So I'm an artist. I was born in St. Louis, Missouri. I currently split my time, as I've told many of you, between a small town in the Bay Area called Canyon and our new house in Westport. So both very, very small towns. I was trying to figure out maybe which town was bigger so I could say one slightly larger town, but they might be the same size. I am formally trained. I have an undergraduate degree in visual art and a MFA in drawing and painting. I approach my work like a painter. So when you see the work and you see the how I treat shapes and forms and all of that, it comes from my formal work. I switched into this technique pretty radically. In the 10 years before I did it, I called myself a wood carver. I made these forms, these three-dimensional forms. I was carving, I was using thin sheet metal and thousands of tiny little escutcheon pins in an equally obsessive vein as I kind of do now. Before that, I worked almost exclusively, again, for maybe 15 years with chalk pastels. So and I started as a painter. So my interest in the work, in making things, my materials have shifted, and my focus becomes, this is what I'm doing now. I don't know if I'll always do it. So far, it seems to be making the shift from matching up this technique with the subject matter of the Holocaust to other urgent concerns. It still seems to make sense. But should it stop making sense, I would change and I would switch. So I was a teacher for 40 years. I recently, the pandemic, I stopped teaching. I had my own studio school. I taught in a Montessori school, and everything stopped. And we were talking about the pandemic was a very good time for artists. And I started working a little bit more quickly, but the series did take me 13 years to make. The pieces are many things. They're memorials, they're educational, they honor the victims, they serve as warnings, and they're also standalone visual experiences of fiber art. And I think the intense technique and the physical labor of making these things matches with the horrific content. So they are like honoring. Through my physical labor and the subject matter, just seems to really make a very good match. The technique basically matches the enormity of the crime. The Holocaust was a complete moral breakdown of society. It was a state-sponsored crime of enormous brutality and horror, such that it is impossible to imagine. A quote from the Nuremberg judgment of 1946 reads, quote, "The Holocaust was a crime of such inconceivable savagery that the mind and the imagination stagger in its contemplation of a human degradation beyond the power of language to adequately portray," unquote. And this is why when you go into a Holocaust museum, you see piles of shoes and eyeglasses and articles of clothing, and you see these artifacts that bring the loss right to your heart. Like you can't deny what was there and what is no more through these things. So, how to make art about it, very difficult thing to think about. And I did think about it initially. This was the first piece that I made, and I made this when I Googled. I started being interested in the Holocaust. Our son was matched up with a survivor through a program in San Francisco, and his learning about what he was learning about got us more interested in what these stories were. And so I Googled, I was very interested, the same way that survivors are talking and telling their stories and having their journeys documented, were the perpetrators or the children of the perpetrators also dealing with what they did and what happened to them and their experiences now that time has passed. I was very interested, even anonymously, like people who were members of the Nazi Party, are they talking at all or writing? And I was curious about that. And so I just did a simple Google search, and all I basically saw were Holocaust denial websites. So this was 2009, and that is what came up, like one after another at the top of the feed. And I thought, well, that was seemed like just a sort of light question, and like, this is really a problem. So I made this piece. It's called Rose-Colored Glass. That is the modern Berlin skyline. And then about 6 months after that, it was Passover, and we were having people to our home, and I went to the local Safeway and bought one of those giant things of matzah, which is the ritual, unleavened bread that you have for a whole week. And I was in it, they sell it, and it came through the checker, and it went into the bagging area, and there was a man standing there who was doing the bagging, and the matzahs were like over there, and he's just standing there. And I sort of motioned, excuse me, could you, because I can't reach it. And he just stared at me. He just stared at me, and he stared at the matzahs, and he stared at me. And it was like what you call a microaggression. And he forced me to basically contort my body around him to retrieve the box. And I thought, well, I guess I'm going to make another piece. Because that I had that happen to me, really, like, so that was important. And I didn't really realize I was making a series, like I said, until about piece number 9. Okay, so I am not a Holocaust survivor. I'm not a child of survivors or a grandchild of survivors, or as they're referred to now, 4Gs. I am Jewish. As children, my grandparents fled the pogroms in Russia and came to America at the turn of the 20th century. I grew up in a middle-class Jewish household. All 4 of my grandparents were immigrants. They all spoke Yiddish. 2 of them never really spoke English. One of them never stopped. My grandfather never referred to the car as anything but the machine. We would take the machine. Will you get me in the machine? But we didn't speak Yiddish. We didn't speak Hebrew. We were not observant except for the major holidays. We didn't, walk to synagogue or whatever. We did the basic stuff. But nobody talked about the Holocaust, which was not unusual. So my grandparents who lost family, they came early, so the people stayed back. Family were lost. Nobody talked about it. They didn't talk about it. My parents didn't talk about it. I went to Hebrew school to be bat mitzvahed. Very thin amount of information. We were told this happened, never forget. But you can't never forget something that you don't know. So, for me as a Jewish person, even in my good public high school, they, in the history class, like, it's pretty glossed over. Once you hit World War II, it's like a very, you see the map, you see maps, and you have general information, but nobody's talking about the experiences of the people. And I think that's why Holocaust denial has taken a foothold, because it has not been really presented besides the statistics. So I started the series in a way too, and continued it, because I realized that if I didn't know, as a Jewish person, if I didn't really get it and didn't really know, then, like, who knows? how many people know, So I started doing a lot of homework. I started reading testimony and reading books and history books and watching film and going on the, Holocaust Museum websites and educating myself. But I do understand why they didn't talk about it. For a long time, I felt angry that nobody sort of told me, but I understand that nobody wants to relive the worst thing that has ever happened and the saddest, biggest losses that anybody has ever had happen. And also to not then be basically defined by the worst thing that's ever happened to you. And so I do, I have a lot of compassion for people that have been through, trauma like that. So I think we're really lucky that the Holocaust museums exist and that there's people are still making films and books are written and there's lectures to go to. And so I'm sort of doing it through my work. Okay, so from a distance, it's really hard to tell what the pieces are made of. They sometimes look like paintings, they look like mosaics, they can look like weavings or tapestry, embroidery or collage. I know that the subject matter is very difficult and that facing the subject matter is surprising. You don't expect to see this subject matter when you go into an art gallery or into an art museum. You expect it when you go into a history museum or a Holocaust museum or a Jewish museum. You're sort of primed. So I know that it's surprising. So my intention is to bring you to the content in a way, to lure you in. So I basically use beauty as a bait. I actually am trying to make the most beautiful thing I can. So it's an interesting artistic challenge to make something very, very attractive so that you come close. You see that it's made of strings, sort of the idea of how somebody would make this thing and spend this much time. And then there you are, and there's the text, and there's the story. And of course, there are numbers and names and places sometimes in some of the work so that you are facing it. So it's, like I said, it's like a spoonful of sugar. Like, how can I bring you? And artists are manipulative. That's what we are. Like, we want you to look at our work, right? Artists are interested, and the longer you can have somebody looking at your piece, the more likely it is that they will understand what you're after and what you want them to know or feel or understand or be connected by, or or repelled or disgusted or whatever, but you have to look, you have to bring the viewer to your work, if that's an intention at all. So how I do it. So the first thing I need is an idea, and I get ideas from all kinds of places. I'm reading, I look at film, I read the newspaper, I talk to people. Sometimes somebody says something in passing, I hear a story about, somebody's grandmother, or from all sorts of different places. Something will perk my interest. And from there, I do some homework, like I do some research. The last thing I want to do is make a piece about something that ends up not being true, or having been spun in a way. If, for example, I had wanted to make a piece about a story of one non-Jewish person who saved one Jewish person, like just this singular story. I was searching for a singular story. Because of course we all, what would we do? You ask yourself, like, if you were that person, what would you do? And so I searched for this story of this one-to-one, and I found numerous stories. And as I started, the ones that I thought were most interesting, I started researching And 75% of them were total fabrications. Total fabrications. So that too was like, I need to really make sure. And I dropped the idea. I was like, I'll do something. I think I'll do something else. Anyway, I had other ideas going too. So once I get an idea, I start searching for images that I think match. And a lot of my work, I use these cartouche designs, like a scrolly, fancy framing kind of device, visual device. And so I'll look for different things from architecture, from book plate illustrations, things that are in the public domain. And I do a big search and I collect images of things that I think will work, or things from the past. And I'd use a lot of architectural details, photographs from corners of buildings and gates and things, especially in Europe. So then I basically make a collage. My images are collaged together of these different things. Sometimes I use text, I use words, I'll say the place. Sometimes I'll just put the year or the number of people that were killed there. So it's I'm creating my picture. I'm deciding what the composition is going to be. I get a piece of plywood, and I'm using this very nice Baltic birch now. I started off with just junky plywood, and I'm elevated now to like cabinet level plywood, so that when I cut it out, clean edges, I don't have to fuss. So I get a piece of plywood, I draw my design on the plywood, I cut it out with a jigsaw, cut the whole thing out, and then I go over my drawing with a Sharpie. It took me like a piece to figure out I need to see the drawing through the wax, like, oh yeah, okay. So I draw it with a Sharpie, and then I coat the entire piece. I use a mixture of beeswax, which makes the surface sticky. I put a little Vaseline or jojoba oil to make it pliant, pliable and soft. And then I sprinkle in a little bit of pine resin so that the material is strong. So it holds the fibers, because the wax is going to act as the adhesive for the string. The string is simply pushed into the wax and the wax is gripping it. So I have my surface, and though Ken has told me repeatedly to just make a recipe, I just don't make a recipe. So cook like that too. So the surfaces do vary somewhat, but they're all pretty close. So then I have my surface, I have my drawing, and I usually by that point I have an idea of what I want the colors to be. I don't make like a colored pencil drawing or, do some graphic, deciding on the color most of the time. Sometimes I do. I use the markup feature on my phone, which was a fantastic discovery. And I'll just tell you about it for a second. You can edit your photos with color. And so I take a photograph of my piece when it's drawn out, and you can basically paint with it. I mean, people have used it on their iPads and stuff all the time. It was new to me, this feature on my phone. And so I can kind of block in certain color ideas. But usually I have an idea of how I want it to look. So then I collect my string. And that very first slide was, I was deciding on my color palette for Lorenzo's Primo. So, I just start collecting color. And in fact, that very first time we came in here, like I needed yellows. Like I did not have good, I can't remember what I was working on. I really needed different kinds of yellow and yellow orange and yellow green. So, I knew exactly what was missing that I didn't have. And of course I found it in there. It's like, and bought too much, but which is, how that is. I have a lot of string now. So then I just start pressing it in. I press it in, I use all kinds of string, I take yarn apart. I made a joke that you guys are spinning and spinning in here, and I'm like unspinning it. I'm like untwisting it if it's too thick. I take apart, sometimes I've taken apart, clothing or sweater or trims. Some of the pieces sometimes use trim. I find some old vintage fancy trim to work in there. I press it in. My special fancy tool is a chopstick. I use a manicure scissors, though I have discovered a scissors now that has a bend to it, a complex curve, so that the handle sticks up from and I can just pick up the scissors, because I cut thousands and thousands and thousands of times, little tiny cut pieces of string. If it's really cold in the room, I use a lamp just to keep it warm. Sometimes I work outside. I would never leave these pieces in a hot car. I will tell you that I have not had a problem. Now, one time I had a little bit of a problem, but basically, like, just it's a stable surface. Stable enough for my needs. But it could melt off of there. Maybe that's part of its power. So I said I was a teacher also. This was one of my students doing a yarn painting. And I started off my teaching career teaching as an adjunct at Modesto Junior College. Worked there right after graduate school for a few years, and then we homeschooled our kids for a few years, and then I went back to work, and I got a job in this trilingual Montessori school in Oakland. The kids spoke, each classroom had 3 teachers. One spoke only French. Like, if you had a math lesson with the French teacher, your lesson was in French. And one Spanish teacher who spoke only Spanish, and one English teacher who spoke only English. So, and the teachers had to they were supposed to pretend that they couldn't speak the other languages. So the kids really learned. They were trilingual students. And what we did every year, almost every year, we went to a different place. We took these international trips where the entire tour was in either French or Spanish or English. But of course, the French teachers and the Spanish teachers were along also. We took these very young children. No parents came. We went to the Yucatan. We went to Oaxaca. We went to Paris. We went to New York. We did a music tour in Hungary, because the head of the school and the music teacher were Hungarian. And a lot of the kids spoke a little Hungarian too. So it wasn't French or Spanish, but that was quite an interesting trip. Anyway, the trip to Oaxaca was going to be an art trip focused on the arts. And so I decided, as the art teacher and in charge of the curriculum, that we would present all the different art techniques that we would encounter. And the kids would work with those materials, and we would work with black clay, and we would make weavings, and we would paint, we'd do some dot painting, and we would paint on bark cloth, and we do all these various things. So I was unfamiliar with a lot of it. So I did a lot of homework and research and wrote the curriculum. And I discovered they're not in Oaxaca, they're in the Sierra Madre range. The Huichol Indians make these yarn paintings. And when I read about this, and of course I was fascinated by how they use it in their spiritual practice. But if you've ever been an art teacher or been a little kid in an art class, the teacher wants to work with yarn. Yarn is so fantastic, beautiful, textural, but they match it with glue. So you're gluing, the kids are trying to glue this yarn onto these pieces of cardboard or whatever, and it's a total mess. It's sticky. It gets on your hands. It pulls the yarn up. It's hard to get it. It's a very frustrating, but it's very common in art class to do that. And I thought, well, this could be the answer to that, because I don't want my students to be more frustrated so I wasn't doing this glue and yarn technique. We were working with yarn and textile and fiber in different ways, but I thought this could be good. So I started experimenting with it and seeing if it would be something to teach, and it completely transformed me. It changed my entire life. It is, and for those of you in the class, you're going to get a taste of it. It's you have this lamp. Your wax still smells like honey. The honey is coming up. It is sensual to push your stick, to push the yarn into the wax, and the wax gives, and it's this beautiful surface that you end up making, and it's healing. It's meditative, and it's healing, and it's lovely. And I was just like, this is pretty nice. And so I started teaching it to the kids, and I do not exaggerate when I say they would come in from recess totally up here, having had lunch, having run around, they charge into the classroom. And if this is the activity, and it was Montessori, so everybody was working on whatever they were working on, but I taught everybody how to do this. The entire classroom is quiet, and everybody is focused and working, and they make things that look like this. So it's like really, really nice. And it took over my practice. So, that's what I do now. So it is, the technique is pretty directly based on what the Huichol people do. And of course they are, they collect peyote, and they have a spiritual component, and they make these things, and they take them into caves, and the shamans are with the ritual and cultural necessity, they do that, and it's really fantastic. And I have this, I'm sure in the library you guys have like fantastic books on Huichol. I haven't looked in there, but I did bring one. This is one, and it's in Spanish and it's in English, and there are some really great images. So in the 60s, the Huichol people started making these things to help support their population. I mean, I think there are only about 50,000 Huichol people left, and a lot of them live in Southern California. A lot of people live in Texas. They've migrated around, but this has become a way of supporting their communities. And there's some really great examples in here. I brought one little painting, and I found this for $5 at Urban Ore. If you've ever been in Berkeley, you've been in, or because I'm looking for old string, right? And I'm like, I saw this, and it's pretty magnificent. It's an old one. It has some moth-eaten places. And then Jackie brought in, the Huichols also do this extraordinary, obsessively highly crafted bead work with these seed beads. And this is really marvelous too. And they're one of their culture, they were not reliant on trade for beads. The Huichols made beads initially from bone and shell and things in nature, and made their own beads, and probably were dyeing them. And so these are, Jackie brought these, like the really extraordinary, amazing. And the color, how they're making a gradation of color, it's really nice. Okay. This was I stuck this slide in here. This was a student work also, and I'll just it's just super sweet. And but for those of you in the class, since I have it here, we're going to talk about creating a gradation of color from light to dark, or in this case, basically yellow, green to blue, how to create what's happening in the background of your picture. There doesn't have to be a form, but there is space. So how to deal with these, and of course, the direction that you take of your yarn. you can make something look fluffy simply by changing the direction, you know. So she did just a super job. That makes me very happy. I tried to trade her for it, but okay. So as you saw in the gallery, and if you read any of the text, you know that there's a paragraph that accompanies each piece. And I'm going to take a minute and I'm going to read the text. This is an abbreviated text for this piece, which is titled Veldiv. And if you go on my website, all the full text is written there, along with just one, maybe two places you can go for more information about the story. So I always say, you know, like, it's difficult. This subject matter is hard sometimes to hear. And it just, I like to just tell people that so that you're just have an understanding, but I think you guys already have, I think you get it. So I read about this particular crime after we got back from our trip to Paris. I had been looking at like the places we were planning to go. What was the history, the Jewish history in these places that we went on these trips with the kids when we went to Paris. And I had been to Paris one other time. And I learned about this, and I decided to make an artwork about it. As I was learning about it, I saw a photograph of this little girl that this event happened to her, and I saw her photo, and her photo just made me stop. It stopped everything in my life, the picture of this little girl. And so I decided to make a piece. And this is essentially the text. Beginning at 4 a.m. on July 16th, 1942, French authorities instructed the French police to round up and arrest all the Jews in Paris. They arrested over 13,000 people. They were held in extremely crowded conditions at the Velodrome d'Hiver, a professional bicycle racing arena, 1 block from the Eiffel Tower. About 6,000 Jews were taken to a transit camp and onto Auschwitz the very next day, leaving 7,000 Jewish people inside at Veldiv in extreme heat, without water, food, or working toilets. After 5 days in these conditions, they were taken on to 3 different concentration camps near Paris. At the beginning of August, all the remaining Jewish adults were taken, being forced to leave their children, ages 16 and under, behind. These 3,000 children were sent alone. They were pushed with strangers into packed rail cattle cars to their deaths in Auschwitz from these camps. The youngest was 18 months old. And this is a shameful event in French history. Like, this is one of those things, like, the French people cannot believe that they did that. But they did that. Her name is Francine. This is the little girl. And when she was registered in Auschwitz, because they were very careful to make sure they had everybody written down, she was 4. She was extremely traumatized, and she only told them that her name was Francine. And after the war, she had some distant family survive, and they did not let her memory disappear. And they had the family photos. And so they searched and searched to figure out what happened to her. Her name is Francine Barrack. And so that's how we know that this happened to her. So Beauty and Terror consists of many different aspects of the Holocaust, from lesser known crimes, things that you may be familiar with, camps, raids, death march, injustice, mass shootings, examples of Holocaust by bullets, where over 1 million people were killed. 1.5 million Jewish people were killed by bullets. It wasn't just the gas chamber, and this is known as Holocaust by bullets. But I also include a few stories of courage and redemption. But these stories don't have happy endings either. Anyway, for most of the individual slides, I'll simply give you a chance to look at the work, and I'll just say one or two sentences about it. I'm not going to read about each one. We'll all be like sobbing at the end if I do that. So this piece is in the gallery. It's about a raid in Novi Sad, Hungary, where police and soldiers rounded up Jews, Serbs, and Gypsies and pushed them off the bridge over the Danube to their deaths. Kamjanec-Podilsky. This happens to be the name of the town where my grandfather was from, although I did not know that when I made this piece. And this was an action where there were Jewish people living in this one area across the border from Hungary. And of course, the borders were shifting. A lot of borders changed and shifted. And at this time of the war, Hungarian Jews were still safe. The Hungarian government they were not turning their Jews over. They were not shipping them out. They were protecting them. If you lived in Hungary, you were still fairly safe. But then the border shifted, and suddenly there were all these new Hungarian Jews, but the Hungarians refused to give papers and sent them on a march into the countryside, where basically they pushed them into the path of the Einsatzgruppen who were shooting them. So I'm sure that I have family that were in this, were part of this event, because this is where they were from. A primary goal of the Nazi regime was to create a superior German race. In 1939, they established a program where they called it euthanasia, and they systematically were murdering their own citizens, children, up to age 17, anyone who had any kind of disability, any physical or mental disability, any diagnosis, even if a child had a limp, even if they were sort of bow-legged or pigeon-toed in one foot, like it did not matter. The children were sent for medical treatment and then died while away. And it took a really long time for parents and people to start, Germans to start to sort of organize, and they rallied the church, and they managed to get this program paused, like stopped for a period of time, and then they started it back up. So the shapes of the pieces and the symbols in the pieces all have meaning. This is just, I tried to create the most vibrant garden of, flowers and leaves and plants that and result in these burned sticks. And this is a really big piece. This is like maybe over 4 feet long. And T4 was the code name that came from the Berlin street address, Tiergartenstrasse 4. And they referred to these children as useless eaters. That is how the government referred to them, which is just like hard to, they felt they were less than human. They were not perfect. This piece is also in the show, Babi Yar. And this is a fairly well-known, one of the better known events. And it was recently in the news because when Putin's war on Ukraine started sometime in the first 6 months, I think, he bombed this place, saying it was accidental. Bombed it and destroyed the memorial museum. There's a memorial museum there. So, this is Kyiv. This is in the news all the time now, this place. And this image here, this is from a photograph that I found of the actual ravine in the center. This one's also in the show. It's about a pogrom that happened after the war. This was the event that basically told all the Jews to not go home, the survivors. There were survivors. The camps were dismantled. People got well enough, and what would we do if it was us? Well, we would go home. We would go home to see if our parents, if our children, if our siblings, if our friends, if our cousins, if anybody survived. So that's your instinct, is to go home. And these people went home to Kielce, Poland. There were about 125 Jews there. And of course, going home, they couldn't go back to their apartments and their homes. They were all occupied by Polish people, and nobody's giving anything back, of course. So they lived in this 3-story apartment building. And so they were kind of concentrated in this building. And the whole thing, well, you can read, I think the text includes the story, it was because, a little boy lied to his parents about what was happening. They said they were committing ritual murder in the basement of this building. And the father went to the police, and they rallied up soldiers and all the men from a factory down the street. And they came and they murdered these people, and, threw babies out the window. And it's like a mass insanity. It's a complete breakdown of, what it means to be human. But obviously this is part of being human. And you notice that I put a lot of these little putti, or these little cupids, in a lot of my work. And I put those in there because in the Renaissance, in art history, and you see a lot of these little putti and these little cupids, and the meaning is that God is present, that it means that God is present. And of course, I'm just like, well, if God is present, what kind of God? It forces you to think about that. This is the Ponari Riflemen. It took place in Lithuania. There was a beautiful, oops, how come it didn't change? Let's see. There it is. Before World War II, the Ponari Forest, it was this beautiful, picturesque, lovely area where people would ski in the winter and picnic in the summer. And all these flowers here, except for these rosebuds, are native flowers from this area. And they essentially, the near total destruction of Lithuanian Jews occurred between 1941 and 1944. And they took care of a lot of them here in the Ponari Forest. This is Primo's Lorenzo. This is obviously in the show. It was also in the summer issue last summer, and Fiber Art Now, you might have seen it. It traveled to the New Bedford Museum in Massachusetts, where it was part of a fiber show there. And how did I decide to make it? I actually wanted to see if I could make a portrait out of string. It's sort of a, I've made a lot of these other things, and I love still life painting, and I make a lot of fruit and flowers and these things, but I wanted to see if I could pull it off, essentially. And I was reading a book by Primo Levi, and I just did a little search about his Holocaust experience, and I just was knocked over. I could not believe this. And you can read about it in the show, but this Italian man, Lorenzo Perrone, he couldn't read, he couldn't write. He was extremely introverted. He was a total alcoholic. He was just didn't really have friends. He was all on his own there, but he was a forced laborer outside of Auschwitz. And Primo Levi was sent on a detail out to work in these make bricks or something like that outside of Auschwitz every day. And they were both from the same tiny, tiny village in Italy, and they spoke a very unique dialect. And so Lorenzo overheard Primo speaking to somebody in this dialect, and he started collecting a little bit of an extra ration. He took a little bit of his soup and one bite of his bread, and then got a couple of the people in his barrack to do the same. And he hid it in a metal tin on the grounds of the brick factory for Primo Levi to collect every day. And he had a tiny little extra ration of food every day for 5.5 months. And he survived. And he said, he saved my life. He reminded me I was a man, his humanity, pretty extraordinary. And Primo Levi had a friend. The two of them were caught together and ended up together in Auschwitz. And they had an arrangement where if either of them had any extra food, even if it was one bite, that they would share it equally. And so Lorenzo Perón not only saved Primo Levi, but also saved his friend. Unfortunately, he didn't survive the death march. Primo Levi was in the infirmary, and so he ended up surviving. They didn't take him on the death march after they liquidated Auschwitz. The Germans took everyone, but his friend perished on the march. And this is a double picture frame that supposedly came from a Jewish household in Berlin. So this is based on, and of course it's the Italian colors. This is Harvest Festival. The Germans were extremely upset that there was pushback. There was Jewish resistance. There was armed conflict in 3 different ghettos, and in Sobibor and in Treblinka, the death camps. There were people, the Jewish people were fighting back. It was not just so perfectly easy. And the Germans were, the Nazis were very, very upset about this because Germans were being killed and it was delaying their process and their intention. And so despite the economic benefit of having these people, they were slave laborers, they instead decided to kill them all. So basically as a retaliation, and unironically named their action Harvest Festival. That is what they called it. And, I love still life painting. I love still life painting so much. And so this, because I'm doing this, I'm telling this horrible story. I want you to know the story. But I'm an artist too, and I want to know if I can make strawberries look round. So, to not forget that is also, that's a part of my pleasure in making the work. This is the White Rose. You've probably heard about this group. They were a group of University of Munich students, not Jewish, obviously, and they were nonviolent resistors. They printed pamphlets in secret and distributed them. They were against the treatment of the Jews. They knew what was going on. Everybody knew what was going on. People knew what was going on. So not knowing does not count for defense. Anyway, they were making sure that other people knew that there were people out there who were opposed and were against it. And they were caught and they were all guillotined. So then they were 19 years old, 20 years old, 21 years old. And the one professor who, Kurt Huber, he was a professor at the university who was sort of helping them. And there's a really good film that's on one of the normal streaming networks called The White Rose. It's a pretty good description of Sophie Scholl and her experience. This is in the show too. Oh, and I should say that the White Rose, didn't switch, perfect. The White Rose is it in focus? Let's see what's happening. It's become a symbol of resistance to tyranny across the world. So White Rose. And I've always been like, if I ever got a tattoo, I think I would get a tattoo of a white rose. It would probably be what I would pick. There we go. At a certain point in making my series, I knew that I was going to have to include a piece about one of the death camps. So I did a lot of reading about what happened in the various camps. And this was truly, truly, truly terrible. It's all terrible. This is really terrible. And, I mean, we're not supposed to like compare terrible things, but, it's worth, learning about this. If you were on the train to Treblinka, you had traveled for days without water or food or anything in a closed rail car, and you would step off, into what appeared to be a perfectly normal train station with flower boxes and wooden benches and a wooden platform. And you kind of would have this moment of, okay, it's a train station. Like this is not funny. Like they thought this was funny. This is just like, anyway, it's worth learning about. Let's see, this is Volari. In the last 10 months of the war, 250,000 people lost their lives, being marched out of camps, being brought to the center of Germany, it being perfectly obvious that the war was lost. The Russians were approaching, and the Germans just emptied their camps and their work where they had them working in places and just marched them through. This particular march, you can read about it in the gallery. It was all women. It was the middle of winter. And I've put, this is Nike, the goddess of victory, because we would not know about this if there hadn't been survivors. And there were women who survived, and they talked a lot about it and told their stories. And I'm very grateful for that. Odessa, this is also something that happened based on a retaliatory action. I've met a lot of people whose entire families were killed in Odessa, and Odessa is also in the news. Beautiful city on the sea. I made this piece after reading Christopher Browning's Ordinary Germans. It's a fantastic book. The Police Battalion 101, they were men from Hamburg, most of them from Hamburg and outside of Hamburg, if you read the text. And I made this piece because, they turned themselves into a vicious, violent, enthusiastic killing squad. It's been well studied. They were out of control. They were controlled, repeatedly given alcohol and money, and but the reason I made the piece really is because after the war they just went home. They were a terrifying group of men. There were 500 of them, and afterwards they just went back to their professions and back to their families, or married and had children or whatever, and continued to live their lives. And I apparently none of them have talked about it. So I find that interesting too. This is Iași. This is a piece about something that happened in Romania. This is the shape is a medal that the Romanian government made and awarded to Germans for their bravery. This is about just a circuitous train journey. You can see the names of the cities. It just ran in a circle. It never left Romania. They put 2,500 people on this train in the blistering heat. They nailed the ventilation slats shut. Even the Germans left the ventilation slats open. And they just, as they came to each town, as they came around to each town, they just opened the cars and threw the bodies of the deceased out and kept riding the train. 200 people survived, and according to the witnesses, they told them then, "Oh, you're alive, you can just go home." So like that's kind of, it's, and these stories and these things, like we feel separated from this. It hasn't been very long, 75 to 80 years. It's not that long. How old are we? Like it's really, and it not necessarily absolutely specific, different kind of circumstances. Like, we're all really aware of what's happening in Alabama. If you read the New York Times today, like, or, you know, what is going on in our country and our government. And if we're going to concentrate power in the office of the president, this can happen. This is, human beings did this, you know, yes, propaganda, yes, you know, fear, yes, all of this stuff. So it's, you know, I make the work so that we can think in a way in advance. Like, what can you do? What can you do? What will you do? What do you think you're capable of doing? If it came to you, if it came to your door. And it's good to think about that. So this is failure of justice, basically because by 1955, West Germany was adjudicating all of its crimes, and the attorneys and the judges had been judges and attorneys during the Third Reich. So, you know, they did denazification, they, you know, to unbrainwash them, I don't know, to try to bring it to back to neutral. And how effective do you think that is? You know, it's a really hard. I mean, I think that Germany is doing a very good job with their memorials and talking about it, and Holocaust education in schools. Unfortunately, they're not getting real traction out in the rural parts of the country and other places. It's the Holocaust educators are being laughed at and booed, and have not been they're not even really able to fulfill the requirements that the German state has for Holocaust education. It's a difficult, but this piece is titled Failure of Justice because West German courts, prosecutors, police committed a failure of justice so extreme as to find anyone who said, I was only doing my job, completely innocent. You know, I was just doing, somebody told me what to do, and I did because I didn't want to be sent to prison or shot or whatever. And so I consider that a huge failure of justice. And of course, by 1958, most of those that were imprisoned were freed. It's a tough one. This is rat lines. This is a very large piece. It's more than 6 feet tall. And when you stand next to it, you feel this presence of it, which was unexpected. It's called rat lines, and the rat lines were a series of secret escape routes across Italy and Spain that were established at the end of World War II, whose sole purpose was to help high-ranking Nazi war criminals escape justice. The International Red Cross and the Vatican were complicit in this program. The International Red Cross created blank travel documents in the tens of thousands and gave them to the Vatican to be filled out by whoever they wanted names on them. So they had legitimate travel documents, a lot of them. And the most, you know, notorious criminals, Nazi leaders, you know, they're here. And they died or were known or were extradited from South America, and their names are there. The flowers are chrysanthemums, which manage to symbolize both longevity and death. I thought was kind of good. Okay, almost done. This is, I do not say you are lying. I say I do not believe you. This is a great story, and there's now a play about this. There's a film about the play. This is Jan Karski and Felix Frankfurter. Jan Karski was a Polish diplomat, Catholic Polish diplomat. He was an incredible person of high moral character, highly intelligent. He spoke a dozen languages. He had a photographic memory. He was respected, and he was just this guy. He was also like really tall, and he joined the underground, the Polish underground, and he became was put on a mission to tell what was happening to Churchill and to Roosevelt, to get out of Poland, to go and tell them. And he said, well, I can go and I can tell them, but why? They're not going to necessarily believe me. He said, I need to see what's happening with my own eyes. And he managed to get himself smuggled into the Warsaw Ghetto, where he saw soldiers using the elderly as target practice. He saw the dying children on the street. He went several times to witness what was happening. So he had to see it with his own eyes. He went to the Ibiza transfer station and dressed up as a guard, like a Ukrainian guard, so that he could watch the Jewish people being herded onto the trains, and how they were being treated, and the dogs and the whole thing. So he watched that happen. And then he said he felt like he could go and be, with authority, tell what was happening. Because his purpose was to, report to the Polish government in exile, but also to talk about what was happening to the Jews, because it was just, they were basically being pretty successful at eliminating all the Jews in Poland. It was just obvious there would be none. And so he did it. He got out. He went to Churchill and he spoke to him. I don't recall exactly what their conversation, but then he came to the US and he met with Felix Frankfurter, who was a Jewish US Supreme Court judge, involved in the Jewish community, highly recognized, highly regarded, very well respected. And they had this conversation, and the Polish diplomat in the US, I forget what they're called, like the envoy person, was also in the meeting. And Karski just basically blurted out his whole tale. He said it took him about 20 minutes. It just all came pouring out of him. And he was just like, this is it. And Karski said, I don't believe it. I don't believe it. And the other guy that was there said, what do you mean you don't believe it? Jan is the most believable person you can ever listen to. And this was what he said next. I do not say you are lying. I say I do not believe you. So, Felix Frankfurter did not act, needless to say. And if you saw the Ken Burns special on the Holocaust that just came out last year, it's all about the US involvement, but it's very good because it explains why he did nothing, which I didn't know. I saw that I made this piece in 2020 or something like that. So knowing the story and seeing seeing that really helps you understand what was happening in this country and how close we came to continuing what was happening. So this is one of my newer pieces. It's called Depopulation. Finished with the Holocaust. I had to really think about what I was going to do. And so this is a piece, it was made it sort of during the pandemic or just after the pandemic. And I just made a list of all of the threats to us that we threaten ourselves with, overpopulation and nanotechnology and, bioterrorism, all the things that I felt, these are really threats. And of course, the fundamentalist ideas. And one more, this is one of my newest pieces, Hopium. And hopium is the intense human desire to hope in the face of all logic. You know, like we really want things to be okay. We hope that someone will do something. We hope that our leaders will get it together, and we hope that, you know, we do a lot of hoping. And I'm really, when I see that word, you know, like I really had a lot of hope for Obama too, you know. But so this piece is you know, what you hope for your children, or for other children, other people's children, you know, that they are self-reliant, that they are intelligent, that they're courageous, you know, that they're compassionate, that they have all of these things. But so many, you know, now are like this. And so, and this also, you know, based on the Roe v. Wade idea, you know, and so I'm very happy with my floating baby up there. I just, Ken is like, he holds the floating baby. It's the size of a baby. It's let's see if there's anything else I wanted to say about that. I don't think so. Yeah. So what's coming up for me? I have two pieces this next month in the annual Emeryville Celebration of the Arts. Part of that show every year, because our studios are in Emeryville. When we're in Canyon, we're also in Emeryville working. I've been invited by SACWA, and so a lot of you probably know that organization. I'm jurying a show in November called Bearing Witness. And when they called me and they asked me, I said, I have to say, like, I did not know about your organization. You know, I did my homework, and it's like, and I said, are you sure you want me? Like, I don't sew, I don't weave, I don't, you know, I'm not, you know, a quilter. Of course, it's not traditional quilts. It's everything there. And they said, you are who we want. You, because of the content. So they have a show called Bearing Witness, and I am very interested to see.
Where will it be?
It's it's a juried show, and I have to look. It is going to be a real show, and I think it's going to travel. I think that's what they do. They have like a couple of places that it goes. So I'm excited about that. I'm also represented by a gallery in Oakland called Transmission Gallery. And I thank them every time I go in, because my work is not commercial. I don't want to sell my work. The work is a body of work. I want it to travel. I'd love for it to travel to museums, or, you know, whatever. I'm working on it, trying to get it out there. So, but you can see my work there if you're in. I mean, they're lovely. They represent me. They want to represent me, even though they will never make a dime. So I do have a solo show there every 3 years too. So that's kind of nice. And before I take questions, if anybody has any questions, I always like to mention and you probably read about this in 2018, there was a research study at the Icahn School of Medicine in New York about epigenetics. And they discovered that the expression of a gene can be altered based on if the parent suffered extreme trauma. So the children of people who suffered extreme trauma were more likely to have anxiety and depression and mood disorders and all kinds of problems, which is fascinating, because it's the expression of the gene. It's not it's not the basic expression of it. It can change. And it got me thinking, like, if trauma can do it, then maybe courage and resistance and resilience and these kinds of things, if we are those kinds of things outwardly, and we're raising our children, and we're guiding children that we see, and we're presenting that maybe the children will be more likely to stand up for justice, to show up for what's right, to have a feeling of, you know, not just have a sense of right and wrong for selfish reasons, but like, you know, and to be like that. So it's like encouraging for us to put it out there, to express your courage, to look for opportunities and to show it, because maybe it can. So thank you very much. So does anybody have any questions? I know it's like no questions. I covered it all. So I
refer to string. Are you also using wool yarn and separating and using it that way?
yes, and like the thin, like the certain weight of it, like sometimes it is, I call it string because if I call it yarn, you know, my thought is, you know, the big thick yarn, you know, I'm gonna knit a sweater with a big yarn, you know, and I don't know the how else to really describe it as, you know, are they string paintings? Are they yarn paintings? I'm not really sure what they are. But the other thing is, I never thought of myself as a fiber artist. I did not until a very good friend of mine who's a member here, and you probably know her, Mirka Naster. I don't know if anybody knows her. She lives in Sea Ranch. You probably don't see her very often. She's an artist. She's also a child of survivors. She was born in a DP camp in Italy, and she and I are good friends. And we went for a walk one day, and she said, "You know, Robin, you're a fiber artist." And I said, She's like, "Yeah, you know, and you might find your people in the fiber world, you know." And she has been absolutely correct. So I have approached, you know, it's been a complete welcoming of my work in the fiber world. So it's, yeah. And I always, you know, and I said it to someone earlier, like the Jewish institutions are not interested in this work. So it's been very interesting that the places that it's been exhibited are not, I'm trying to, because I think they're just missing the point. Someone will eventually.
What is their rationale for?
I think part of it is that I don't have a doctorate in genocide studies, or I'm not a historian. You know, I don't have the degrees like that. Maybe that's part of it. It's art. You know, historians, it's history, it's facts, it's documents, it's maps, it's statistics, it's data. This is art, you know, this is different, you know, and so that's, you know, that's a little harder maybe. And like I said, Holocaust education through art is not, it's not a thing really. Yeah.
I would just like to say that, you know, it's a privilege to have you.
Oh, thank you, Jackie.
And at the end of the month, a group of people are coming to visit with me and with PTA, and they're coming from all over the United States and Canada, and they will all see your work too.
Awesome.
They'll still be here, and I'm so pleased about that.
Yeah, thank you. And now you can tell them a little more about it, and, you
It's
know.
interesting because they're all tapestry artists.
Yes.
And you know, from a distance,
Yeah.
you know, it looks like a jacket.
Yeah, and I'm interested in tapestry. I'm thinking, you know, it could be, yeah, the next thing, like something. Yeah, I'm very interested.